Subclassing is here, and I don't think that we have ever seen a more drastic change to the meta than what Update 47 has given us. I mean, there's so many new choices, new options, and new combinations to sort through, and they're all so convoluted and confusing, but that is why I'm bringing you the first of a series of mini guides that will outline the different meta subclassing combos, teaching you how to build and play each of these new specs, starting with potentially one of the most popular combos for raiding, Aedric Spear. So to start this video, I think that it's best to discuss the three subclass trees that we picked. Now, the meta currently is pretty stale. Herald of the Tome and Assassination are practically a necessity in any DD build that's looking to be relevant in organized raiding. The third tree that we picked, though, is a bit more ambiguous. We actually have some options here: Aedric Spear, Dawn's Wrath, Ardent Flame, Gravelord, and a few more. But why are Herald of the Tome and Assassination so dominant? I mean, sure, they contain some of the most powerful abilities in the game. Herald of the Tome has Fate Carver and Languid Eye, and Assassination has Relentless Focused and Soul Harvest. These skills are incredibly powerful, sure, but what makes these trees truly dominant are their passives. In fact, being able to combine these trees has completely changed the 12-man raid comp thanks to some crucial pen and crit damage passives. From the Herald of the Tome tree, Splintered Secrets increases our pen by 1240 per Herald of the Tome ability slotted. This will on average give us 2480 pen on the front bar with Fate Carver and Flail, and it gives us the option to potentially slot a skill like Scholarship on the front bar as well in some situations to bump that up to 3720. In terms of crit damage, the Fated Fortune passive in the Herald of the Tome tree gives us 12% critical damage whenever we build or consume Crux. The Assassination tree gives us 10% critical damage whenever we deal critical damage thanks to our Hemorrhaging passive, and the Piercing Spear passive gives us 12% critical damage with an Aedric Spear ability slotted. Popping up on your screen are some basic calculations for pen and crit damage in a 12-man setting, but the takeaway that you need to know is that these four passives make optimized damage dealing in PvE scenarios far easier without the necessity to run sets like Alkosh or EC. In addition to strong damage dealing abilities and stat passives that we discussed, Herald of the Tome and Assassination specifically offer even more passive buffs for dealing damage that we simply can't ignore. You get 284 weapon and spell damage permanently from Harnessed Quintessence in Herald of the Tome, and an extra 6.6% crit chance when flanking a target from Master Assassin in the Assassination tree, another 2.5% crit chance, so that's nearly 10% total for having just one Assassination ability slotted through the Pressure Points passive, and we get an increase in damage and chance to apply status effects, which includes significant sources of damage like burning or poisoned through our Psychic Legion passive in Herald of the Tome. The Aedric Spear flavor adds two main components to this more or less standard meta build. Balanced Warrior gives us another 6% weapon and spell damage, and far more importantly, Aedric Spear's main value comes from Burning Light. Whenever we deal damage, we generate a stack of Burning Light, and at 4 stacks, we deal a big tick of damage to our target. By simply putting points into Aedric Spear, even if we don't have an ability slotted, these two passives make Aedric Spear arguably the strongest third tree for DPSing, and if not, certainly within the top 3. Burning Light will do more DPS than Scholarship, coming in as our 4th strongest source of damage at 7.3k DPS. It gives us an entire ability that's stronger than any one skill in our toolkit with the exception of Fate Carver and our ultimate, and we never have to even cast it. Combine this with the extra raid utility that we get from having an extra crit damage passive, and it becomes extraordinarily clear why Aedric Spear will be such a common choice for 12-man raiding. So without further ado, let's get into the build. If you're newer to the game, all of the different things that you need for raiding might feel a bit confusing. Food, potions, mundus, etc. To make it simple, I'm going to give you a checklist of all of the miscellaneous items that you need to maximize your damage so that you don't have to worry. This checklist includes your race, mundus, attributes, food, potions, traits, enchants, and champion points. So with that, starting with our race, whichever option you choose will have an extremely minimal impact on your overall damage, with maybe the exception being solo content. For organized 12-man raiding, Dark Elf will be the absolute strongest option when you're speccing for stam, giving the most stats out of any other choice. If you're speccing into mag though, High Elf will technically be the strongest option, giving 100 extra max mag and providing some much needed sustain help. The only issue with High Elf is that it's only worth using if you are for sure going mag. Dark Elf is equally good for mag and stam specs because this race gives both max mag and stam, whereas High Elf only gives max mag. So if you're not sure whether you'd rather play a stam or mag spec, I'd suggest Dark Elf. but if you want to go with mag, play High Elf. Now that said, in solo or 4-man content, Khajiit will be better than either of these racial options. This class offers a ton of passive crit damage, one of the most important stats in the game, and one that's difficult to source outside of 12-man content. For our Mundus Stone, the Thief will almost always be the best option, offering a ton of crit chance. The Apprentice or the Warrior, though, are becoming more popular choices when using sets that put our crit chance above 80%. The most common culprit currently being Highland Sentinel. This is most common on dummy parses, and doing so will technically result in higher potential damage, but it will make your parses far less consistent with less crit chance, which I personally find too annoying to even bother with. For our attributes, we'll be putting all 64 points into stamina. All of your abilities in ESO deal damage based on your highest defensive stat between the different pairs of them. Weapon or spell damage, weapon or spell crit, and max mag or stamina. So if your stam pool is just 1 point higher than your mag pool, for example, all of your abilities will scale in damage based on your stamina. Therefore, we'll see the highest DPS increase by putting them all into one pool. For our consumables, we will use food and potions to do two main things: increase our max stats and therefore damage, and to help with any sustain issues that we might have. If you have sustain issues, you can use food to solve your problem. However, most sustain issues come from a poor rotation, so I would attempt to solve your problem there first and only use food to solve sustain issues as a last resort. For straight damage, the green max stam food options will always be the best. However, most players tend to run blue max stam max health food mainly because they offer only a little less max stam but give a ton of health. It's one of few situations where the amount of survivability we gain is worth the small amount of damage that we lose. If you're struggling with sustain, you can use Lava Foot, which offers max stam and a ton of recovery, or Artaean Pickled Fishbowl, which gives less stam and stam recovery, but it does offer a little bit of health, creating a nice middle ground. For our potions, there are two main options to choose from. Heroism potions have the highest damage potential, restoring mag and stam when consumed, but also offering minor heroism, which gives us some fantastic ult gen. These are very expensive though, so simple tri-stat pots will work fine, simply for the sake of having something to restore our mag and stam. Running either of these options is only possible though when we source our major crit chance buffs through a skill like Camo Hunter or Banner Bearer, and our major weapon and spell damage buffs with a skill like Inspired Scholarship. In 12-man content, the major weapon and spell damage buffs are usually provided to you via a player running the Earthen Heart tree with igneous weapons. But in solo content where you might have to drop Camo Hunter, you may have to run the Alliance Battle Draft to source this essential buff, unless you're getting it from somewhere else like the Oakensill Mythic, for example. For our gear traits and enchants, our body pieces are super simple. They'll almost always be Divines with max stamina enchants. Our jewelry will almost always be Bloodthirsty with weapon damage enchants. Our weapons are the only thing that can vary a bit, but generically run your front bar weapon or weapons charged and your back bar infused. When running daggers on the front bar, flame and poison enchants will typically be the best option. And if you have a two-handed weapon on the front bar, run a flame enchant. On the back bar, use a weapon damage enchant. As a note, running a precise lightning staff with a flame enchant on the front bar is becoming more and more popular in fights where you can't consistently keep up quick cloak, so just bear that in mind as you make this decision. Finally, for our champion points, I suggest running Biting Aura, Master at Arms, Wrathful Strikes, and Fighting Finesse or Exploiter. In general, the first three CP are choices that will never leave your bar, and they'll just offer the highest damage increase with this bar setup. Fighting Finesse, however, is something that I recommend for newer players and newer groups who might suffer from a less optimized comp and or lower uptimes from the support that would keep your crit damage from hitting that 125% cap. In 4-man and solo content, you probably won't be able to hit the crit cap without this CP, so it's just a good generic option. You can run Backstabber if you're sure that you can stand behind your target for the entire duration of a fight if you'd like, for 2% extra crit damage, but if your group is very optimized in these 4 and 12-man situations, you should run Exploiter instead, which is one of, if not the strongest champion point slottables in the game. It just relies on other people doing a really good job with uptimes in order for you to gain any value. This is the CP that we use though while parsing on the dummy. Getting into our gear options for the patch, I'm going to give a generic setup that's going to act as a one-size-fits-all gear combo for strong damage in any situation. However, I will briefly go over a couple of extra setups that you can use to min-max your damage situationally, and I plan on expanding on these setups in great detail in a future comprehensive DPS guide. So with that, the best overall setup for this patch will be Perfected Onsl's Torment paired with Deadly Strikes, the Velothir Mage's Amulet, the VMA Inferno, and One Piece Slime Craw. Perfected Onsl's Torment is a medium armor set from the Trial Sanity's Edge that increases your damage done by 7%, a bonus that doubles to 14% if you get an interrupt. There are very few fights in the game though where everybody can really benefit from this 14% increase, so when we talk about Onsl, we are only analyzing that 7% damage done bonus. Now, 7% is a super arbitrary number that sounds sounds good, but I think it's easier to understand this value by comparing it to sets that we know a little bit more about. For example, a set that is historically meta, Coral Riptide, provides roughly an 8% DPS increase when at 33% stamina, so Onsol has always been a very close second. This patch, however, thanks to our new subclassing passives, we can now hit the pen cap if we run a set that gives a line of pen, which allows the group to drop Alkosh altogether, and Onsol gives a line of pen for its fourth piece to make this possible, and everybody taking that 1% DPS loss to get another damage dealer in a full parse set ends up resulting in an overall group DPS gain. Now, in addition to this, sustain has gotten tremendously more difficult, which has made Coral Riptide much more difficult to maintain well, and it's really just not worth using for that small marginal gain for most players. As a note, I am still using it with success in Lucent Citadel. I am sustaining it most of the time, but it is a lot trickier, so it's doable. It's just, I mean, frankly, it's annoying. In any case, a final consideration, in the past, we would also think about using strong proc sets over Riptide when we wanted to replace it, such as Perfected World of Depths, for example. This patch, damage from abilities has gotten so high, though, that the relatively standard 10 to 12k DPS we would get from a set like Depths is now only worth 7-ish% of our total DPS as opposed to 8 to 9% from last patch. Just a quick math on that, 10 to 12k out of a 130k parse makes Depths more valuable than a 10 to 12k value out of a 160 to 170k parse. This concept demonstrates why running sets that are going to increase stats to buff our abilities will be more valuable with subclassing than proc sets. So our next 5-piece set, Deadly Strikes, is arguably more valuable than our trial set this patch. This is a medium armor set from the Velastris vendor in Cyrodiil that increases our damage done with channeled and damage over time effects by 15%. This will buff our main spammable Fate Carver in addition to most of the abilities in this toolkit: Cloak, Shards, Stampede, Fulminating Rune, and more important status effects like Burning. It's a no-brainer. The Velothir Mage's Amulet is an essential mythic this patch. It gives 1,650 pen, minor force, and increases our damage done by 10%. This is at the cost of our light attack damage though, as Velothir will decrease our damage done with light attacks by 99%. The 1650 pen is important for hitting pen cap in a raid comp when dropping Alkosh. Minor force is now very important since we don't slot trap as a part of our meta toolkit anymore, and the 10% damage done increase that we get at the cost of our light attacks is an easy trade-off. In a Fate Carver meta, we light attack significantly less than we might in a non-beam build, and this means our light attacks that would normally be worth 7 to 8% of our total DPS output would now be worth much less, closer to 4 to 5%. It's an obvious and significant damage gain from a mythic that also provides us essential buffs. It's a must-have. Our arena weapon, coming from the Maelstrom arena, Perfected Crushing Wall, is a staff that increases our damage done with Wall of Elements by X amount. Wall of Elements is already one of the strongest abilities in the game, and one of its most valuable components is its size. The VMA Inferno buffs this ability to make it worth nearly as much DPS as full proc sets like Reli or No Arca, but instead of hitting only one target, it will hit every target in Wall's massive AoE. I threw this into the beginner setup because it's a weapon that's already generically meta in AoE fights, which suggests it's very strong. It also leaves a little more room for error than a weapon like the VMA Greatsword by costing mag, which makes sustain quite a bit easier in the stamina spec. Finally, one-piece Slimecraw. This is a bit of a flex here. Slimecraw got nerfed in update 46, so the best damage increase in this build would be to run one piece of a monster set that offers a line of crit chance. There are a few options. Slimecraw is just the one that I slotted here. Alternatively though, if you are under the pen cap still, you can run either a light Slimecraw for the extra light monster, or one that gives a line of pen like Valken Scoria, just depending on how much penetration you need. Now for these next few gear combos, remember I won't go into great detail about each of these sets in this video, but I still want to make sure that you know they exist, especially for those looking to make use of Wizard Wardrobes, a gear swapping add-on that even console players have access to now. But first, if you don't have access to a trial set like Onsol, the best beginner setup that I'd recommend would be to pair Deadly Strikes with Tideborn Windstalker, which is a craftable from the New Zone Solstice, in addition to the Velothir Mage's Amulet, the VMA Inferno, and one-piece Slimecraw. Now again, this isn't the best overall setup for anything, but it will do very well, and it's very easy to get your hands on. Our best single target, and therefore dummy setup, will include Perfected Slivers of Null Arca from the trial Lucent Citadel, Highland Sentinel, which is a craftable from Westweald, the VMA Greatsword, the Velothir Mage's Amulet, and one-piece Slimecraw. If you're in a fight that is mobile, you can simply replace Highland with Deadly Strikes. Now our best overall trash setup combines Perfected Solzon's Torment from the trial Rockgrove, Deadly Strikes, the Velathier Mage's Amulet, the VMA Inferno, and One Piece Slime Craw. You can get super sweaty and trash though depending on group goals. It's common to slot Souls on to get the 30-second buff, then to run Onsul instead while you have the buff, Mechanical Acuity whenever you choose to drop an ult, and then occasionally Arcasis before and sometimes even after bosses to get ult back quicker. And again, this will take its own video, but I'd figure I'd at least mention these setups so that you know they exist. Getting into our skill setup for this build, starting on the front bar with the most important ability in this toolkit, Exhausting Fate Carver. Now this skill is by far the strongest ability in the game, dealing massive damage in a pretty sizable AoE carpet with an extensive range. This skill ticks once every 0.3 seconds for up to 60k per tick, and it will hit up to 6 enemies within its path, lasting for 5 total seconds. It will be responsible for well over 50% of our total DPS output, and maximizing damage with this ability is what our entire rotation is built around. In order to maximize damage with Fate Carver, we must consume 3 Crux to get its full value, and we have many abilities that we use to build Crux, the first of which we'll discuss is Cephiliarch's Flail. This ability will deal decent damage, apply a debuff called Abyssal Ink, which will increase the damage that you deal to an afflicted target by 5%, and it will build Crux whenever cast. Generally, we will only ever cast Flail when we are at 2 Crux, and when we will not get a 3rd Crux before our next beam. We'll break this usage down more in the final section of the video. Our primary builder of Crux, though, is Banner Bearer. This is a scribed ability, and the scripts that you choose really depend on the situation, but in general, you'll always choose the Class Mastery Signature script, which will give 1 Crux every 5 seconds. The Focus and Affix scripts depend on group comps, and as a gross generalization, run Magic if your group is in a meta comp, opting for Inferno Staves on the back bar, or the Shock Focus if your group is in a meta comp, opting for Great Swords on the back bar. If you switch between the two with add-ons, prioritize Shock if you're most concerned about single target, and Magic if you're more concerned about AoE damage. For the Affix script, run Courage if there is no Yolnahcrynin group as a priority, and then Heroism if you can't afford ult pots or Prophecy Savagery for more damage in combination with ulti pots. For example, the Banner Bearer combo that we use on the dummy is Shock, which increases direct damage done by 6%, Class Mastery for that Crux gen, and Prophecy and Savagery so that we don't need Camo Hunter. It's a little complicated, but just make sure that between all of these combinations that you have Heroism from somewhere, Prophecy and Savagery from somewhere, and Courage from somewhere, whether that be Banner Bearer or Yolnahcrynin. And with that, our 2 flex slots, so to speak, on the front bar, starting with Quick Cloak. Ideally, you don't want to take this skill off unless you absolutely have to. It's a multifaceted ability. It does good damage, it procs our enchants consistently, which we would historically rely on our light attacks to do, but it'll proc our weapon enchants while we're beaming and therefore give us better status effect uptimes, and it gives major evasion, which reduces damage taken by AoE attacks by 20%. It's also a massive defensive buff. Now, our go-to flex slot is where we will slot Blazing Spear. We never actually cast this ability outside of a pre-buff. It's on our bar to activate our Piercing Spear passive, which increases our crit damage by 12%. Now, this will only apply to the bar that it's slotted on, but we can get away with having less crit damage on the back bar because well over 70% of our total DPS output comes from the front bar anyway. Now, that said, if your team has a good raid comp, you might not need the extra crit damage, so this can act as a true flex slot. The majority of the damage gain that we get from running the Aedric Spear tree actually comes from that Burning Light passive that we talked about earlier, not from any one ability in this tree. So in this slot, if you don't need Blazing Spear for the extra crit damage, I would strongly advise using Camo Hunter if you need a source of Prophecy Savagery, or Barb Trap for extra damage if you already have that buff. And if you get to run Barb Trap, be at the crit cap, and source Prophecy and Savagery from Banner, that will be the largest individual DPS gain, and that is actually our dummy setup. As a final note for these flex slots, if you find yourself running a Lightning Staff, which is sneaking its way into the meta for some fights, you should run both Camo Hunter and Trap over Cloak and Blazing Spear. But again, only if you're at that crit cap and don't need the Piercing Spear passive. A little complicated, but that's as complex as it gets. So our ultimate on the front bar will be Soul Harvest. When we cast this ability, we increase our damage done by 20% for 8 seconds, and while this increase is very strong, our Languid Eye will be worth more DPS most of the time. So this is an ult that we will only ever actually cast at the end of a fight if we know that we won't get our Languid Eye back. We choose the Soul Harvest morph because it will restore ult whenever we kill a target, but bear in mind that you must get the final blow to proc this passive. Moving on to our back bar, starting with Relentless Focus. This is yet another slot it and don't touch it type of ability. Whenever you light attack, you build a stack of Relentless Focus, which increases weapon and spell damage by 40, stacking up to 10 times for a total of 400 weapon and spell damage. Now, you can activate this ability at 5 stacks to fire a Spectral Bow, and while it will do a ton of damage, it won't deal enough damage to outweigh the benefit of a skill simply stacking 10 times and buffing Fate Carver. This next slot is for a weapon ability that will correspond to our arena weapon. Stampede if we're running the VMA Greatsword, or Elemental Blockade if we're running the Maelstrom Inferno. Both of these abilities will do very strong damage, proc our incredibly strong arena weapons, and maybe most importantly, maintain our backbar weapon enchant consistently. Next up, Inspired Scholarship. This is the last crux-jetting ability that we have. Scholarship will pulse once every 3 seconds, and dealing damage with a class ability in this pulse window will proc an actual tick of Scholarship, which will do strong damage and give us 1 crux if we have 0. So since Fate Carver is a class ability, the way that this will always play out is we will cast Fate Carver, which will bring us from 3 crux to 0, and then usually at some point within that first second of casting Fate Carver, Scholarship will proc, bringing us immediately back up to 1 crux right after casting Fate Carver. This proc of Scholarship plus a reliable crux proc of Banner once every 5 seconds means that we usually have to flail just 1 time between beams to get to 3 crux, and sometimes we don't even have to do that. Fulminating Rune is our backbar flex slot and the weakest ability in this toolkit. Fulminating Rune will do a decent bit of damage over time, a strong AoE burst of damage 5 seconds into its application, and it will provide the Rune Break synergy to 3 players, which is one of the strongest synergies in the game. Our last primary skill on the back bar is Banner Bearer. We do have to double bar this ability, otherwise it will turn off when we bar swap. So with that, our primary ultimate of choice, the Languid Eye, is one of the absolute strongest ultimates in the game. The only ult that is potentially stronger is the standard, and we won't have access to that ability in this build. Make sure that you choose the Languid Eye morph. A lot of players get caught choosing the other morph which follows your target, but this does quite a bit less damage, and you can move your Languid Eye if needed by simply hitting your ult button again and aiming in a new location. Before getting into the rotation, I wanted to briefly discuss a couple of defensive skills to be aware of in case you find a fight demands more survivability. The first is the other morph of Exhausting Fate Carver, Pragmatic Fate Carver, and this skill will do a bit less damage, but it offers a massive damage shield while channeling. It truly is a must-have in any progression scenario, but I don't want to downplay the damage loss. The actual ticks of damage are unaffected, but you channel the ability for a full second less. And this damage loss is significant, somewhere in the 5 to sometimes even 10% range, and that especially depends on how AoE oriented a fight is. The shield is so strong though that this trade-off is usually worthwhile. Exhausting tends to be reserved for score pushes, while Pragmatic tends to be used in trifecta in progression scenarios. If you need a heal, I'd suggest either Resolving or Echoing Vigor. Resolving will be stronger if you're casting a heal for yourself with no real group coordination. However, Echoing will be much stronger if you're stacking it with other players. If you're in a situation where all 8 damage dealers can run Echoing and cast it at roughly the same time, 2 big things happen. A, multiple players get multiple stacks of the strong hot, and yes, it does stack. And B, casting it at roughly the same time means that it will likely never be cast at the exact same time, which will cause the ticks of healing to happen between other ticks of healing. Most HOTS in ESO tick once every 2 seconds, and mechanics are now designed with that type of healing in mind. There are a lot of situations in difficult content where having ticks of healing, even if they're small here and there between gaps of major healer cooldowns, can get your health up just enough to survive a consecutive tick of damage from an overlapping mechanic. It's a very powerful defensive strategy. Finally, getting into the rotation for this build, I'm going to go over both a static and dynamic rotation. A static rotation is a roto that uses the exact same sequence of abilities over and over, and therefore tends to be a bit easier than a dynamic rotation, which is based around watching and tracking your timers and executing concepts rather than the same series of buttons. The trade-off is that a dynamic rotation tends to deal a bit more damage, but the difference is pretty small. I managed to hit 165k with the dynamic rotation and 161.5k with the static, so truly just do what works best for you. As a note, for both of these rotations, by far the most difficult part of dummy parsing this patch is sustain. And for the dummy specifically, I had the best luck spec actually into Magicka as a high elf for the race's sustain passive, but I was able to somewhat consistently finish parses as a dark elf spec for stam. So it is doable, but truthfully it's miserable. Don't stress though, while sustaining on the dummy can be tricky, it's much easier to sustain in content, especially with an optimized group. trap. And that is truly what this build is designed for. Like I said, I'm maintaining Coral Riptide with probably 90% success in content with this build. So use the dummy to practice, but don't be discouraged if it feels a bit harder than you'd like it to. Now, there are 3 key things that you should try to do to help make sustain more manageable on the dummy. 1. Run Parse Food, Lava Foot for Stam, and Ghastly Eyeball for Mag. 2nd, cook a potion. You want to start the parse when your potion timer is about halfway through its duration. In this way, you can take your first shard synergy after your first or second beam to get you back up to 100% stamina, and then your potion should be off cooldown about 10 seconds after that shard to bring you back up to 100% again. This will also line your sustain cooldowns up so that they are offset. Your shard synergy is available every 20 seconds and your potion roughly every 40 seconds. So you'll get a shard, then in 10 seconds you'll get a potion, then in 10 seconds you'll get a shard, then in 20 seconds you'll get another shard, and then it repeats. 10 seconds potion, 10 seconds shard, so on. If you line these cooldowns up though so that you're getting your shard and your potion back at the same time, you're going to find yourself gassed out on resources. And while you'll get a bunch of resources back all at the same time, having a more constant flux of resources in every 10 to 20 seconds ends up being quite a bit more beneficial. The final thing that you can do to help your sustain is to attempt to track Crux dynamically. Scholarship and Banner will sometimes create instances where you don't have to flail at all to be at 3 Crux, which means that you can skip an extremely expensive ability. Doing this just a few times in a parse can make all the difference. For example, if Scholarship procs right after a beam cast and then Banner happens to proc 2 seconds later, you'll channel Fate Carver for about 2 more seconds, and if you have, say, 3 dots that need to be reapplied, 5 total seconds will have passed and Banner will proc again, bringing you to 3 Crux. The easiest way to track this is by looking at your Crux timer. That timer will never hit 25. You'll always get a Crux to gen while Banner is active right after that timer says 26. If you can learn how to plan your rotation around this a little bit, sustaining stamina will be much easier. So with all of that out of the way, let's look at the static rotation. Start by ensuring that you have 3 Crux before beginning the parse. Then we will begin the pre-buff, which just means the series of skills that we cast before entering combat. That pre-buff will go Scholarship, Cloak, Trap, or Blazing Spear, and then we will throw our first light attack signaling the opening of the parse. That opening goes Languid Eye, Stampede, Flail, Fate Carver. Flail, Fulminating Rune, Fate Carver. Flail, Stampede, Fate Carver. Flail, Fate Carver. Then we will start the actual rotation, which we will repeat until the dummy dies. That rotation goes Cloak, Scholarship, Stampede, Fulminating Rune, Flail, Fate Carver. Flail, Fate Carver. Flail, Stampede, Fate Carver, Flail, Fate Carver, and repeat. Cast your Languid Eye as an additive into the rotation whenever it's ready. If you approach the end of a fight and get a Soul Harvest knowing that you cannot use a full duration Languid, go ahead and cast it as long as you're above 700k boss HP. If you get Soul Harvest back but are below this threshold, simply ignore it and cast Flail and Beam until the dummy dies. For our dynamic rotation, the name of the game is Crux Tracking. Try to make decisions about whether or not to flail. And as a rule of thumb, if you need to reapply a full series of dots, you probably won't need to flail between beams. But if you only need to apply 1 or 2, you probably will need to flail. In any case, track your Crux timer, and remember, it will never hit 25 seconds. It will always gen a Crux at 25 instead. If you run into a situation where multiple dots are about to expire at the same time, you should follow this priority of reapplication, which will tell you the skills to prioritize in this scenario based on a skill's buff utility or its straight damage value. That priority goes Abyssal Ink from Flail, Stampede or Wall, Ult, Scholarship, Cloak, Fulminating Rune. With that, getting into our rotation, make sure that you have 3 Crux before beginning the parse. If you'd like to get a little sweaty, you can cast Dawnbreaker before hitting your well for a little boost at the beginning of a fight. And I also felt that pre-casting Rally was helpful for sustain. But in any case, you'll begin the pre-buff by casting Scholarship, Cloak, and run up to the dummy and cast Trap, followed by your first light attack signaling the opening of the parse. That opening goes Languid Eye, Stampede, Flail, Fate Carver. Flail, Fulminating Rune, Fate Carver, and from here on out, we will reapply skills whenever they expire following that priority of reapplication discussed earlier when necessary. Try to cast your ult as soon as it's ready, attempting to line an ult up with an off-balance proc whenever possible. If you approach the end of a fight and get a Soul Harvest knowing that you cannot use a full duration Languid, go ahead and cast it as long as you are above 700k boss HP. If you get a Soul Harvest back though and are below this threshold, simply ignore it and cast Flail and Beam until the dummy dies. And that wraps up our first mini guide in a series discussing the meta builds, but Aedric Spear is just one of many combos that are going to be sneaking its way into the meta with subclassing. We still need to talk about Ardent Flame, Gravelord, Dawn's Wrath, buff builds, non-beam builds, and so much more. These mini guides are on the way, but for now, prepare yourself because having the right build doesn't matter if you don't know how damage dealing works in ESO. This is such a convoluted topic that I feel like good information, especially with subclassing, doesn't really exist for. And that is why I have started a how to deal damage series with the first 2 videos of 10 already out, which you can check out next right here.